Have you ever felt whole on the outside, but completely shattered on the inside? He returned from war with his body intact, but his soul in ruins. Sitting on the edge of his bed, in a house that no longer felt like his, a former soldier stared at the floor as if trying to find some meaning to carry on. The silence was heavy. The days dragged on, and even surrounded by people, he felt alone like never before. This isn't just the story of a veteran scarred by war. It's about invisible scars, the kind that don't bleed but scream when no one is looking. There were no medals to soothe the sleepless nights, no honor to erase the sounds that still echoed in his mind. The soldier had survived, but had he truly returned? The truth is, for him, the war never ended. It simply changed scenery. The battle was now internal, against the ghosts that haunted him, against the fear of loving, against the risk of feeling. Because when everything inside you is in ruins, even a hug seems dangerous. And that's exactly where this story begins. Maybe you know someone like this. Maybe you are that someone. Someone who has been through so much that they no longer know how to trust, who has built walls so high that even love seems like an enemy. Stay with me until the end, because what you discover now may surprise you and perhaps even spark hope where today there is only pain. That night, no one saw him cry silently. No one heard the muffled plea that escaped his lips. Just let me feel again, just one more time. But someone, unexpectedly, did. It wasn't a therapist, nor a close friend. It was someone he never would have imagined. An unlikely encounter with a simple, discreet person who didn't promise a cure, but offered presence. And sometimes, that's all we need to get started. Have you ever been through this? Did you ever think no one would be able to understand what's going on inside? He thought so too, until that moment, until that look, until that small gesture that broke a piece of his armor. From that moment on, something began to change. It wasn't quick, it wasn't easy, but it was real. And now the question remains, how did someone so wounded manage to relearn to love? How is a heart hardened by pain touched by hope where it was least expected? The answer may move you, and more than that, it may transform the way you see your own scars. Because this story, his story, is just beginning. He didn't know how to open up, but little by little, he began to let out small signs. A calmer look, a less harsh response, a shy smile that came without warning after so long. It wasn't about forgetting what he'd experienced, but about discovering that there was still room for something new, and that maybe, just maybe, it was still possible to love without fear. What that person did for him wasn't a miracle, it was humanity. And it was in that simple, almost silent encounter that the rebuilding of everything the war had destroyed began. If this topic resonates with you, leave a comment below with what's touched you most so far. Sometimes sharing what we feel can be the first step toward healing what still hurts. It can also touch the heart of someone going through the same invisible battle. Your voice matters. Your story can be the thread that connects someone else to this chain of healing and empathy. And if this message resonates with you in some special way, if it awakened something deep inside you, like the video, this helps show YouTube that this kind of content, that it speaks with truth, with soul, with humanity, is worth sharing. Your like is like an outstretched hand, simple, yet full of meaning. Oh, and if you feel like you need more stories like this, more encounters that remind us of what's essential, subscribe to the channel. Your presence here makes all the difference. It's what keeps this space alive, pulsating, and able to reach those who need to hear that they're not alone. Because what comes next goes even deeper into this transformation. When he walked through the front door, no one knew what to say. There was no applause, no warm hugs, just a strange, uncomfortable silence, as if everyone were waiting for a man who no longer existed. The house was the same, the furniture, the smell, the familiar faces, but everything seemed distant, as if he were observing his own life from outside a window, a stranger in his own home. The first few days were filled with trials. They tried to talk, tried to smile, feign normalcy, but he couldn't respond. His head spun on a different frequency. At night, when the house slept, he remained awake, not by choice, but because his body wouldn't relax. Sleep had been replaced by constant vigilance, as if the slightest noise could be a sign of danger. And worst of all, he often wished he could hear the sounds of war, because the silence of home seemed more threatening. His body was there, but his soul seemed lost in a place he couldn't explain. The war had left deep scars, not on his limbs but on his mind. It was like carrying an invisible weight on his shoulders all the time. a pain no one saw but that consumed him from within. The words "I'm fine" became his most frequently used shield, but behind them was a muffled cry, "I don't know who I am anymore." The family walked around him as if walking on broken glass, cautious, careful, but confused. After all, he was back. He was there. Why then did he seem so absent? He moved away from his children, avoided his wife's touch, and looked away during conversations. The mere sound of laughter in the next room made him feel out of place. It was as if he were watching his own life but unable to participate in it. Little by little, relationships began to fray, not for lack of love, but for lack of access. No one could reach him, and even though he wanted to, he didn't know how to ask for help. His soldier's pride, the rigidity of his training, the mentality that feeling is weakness, all of this kept him trapped in a cocoon of pain. A cocoon where even the hidden truth about himself was difficult to face, because the greatest battle wasn't against what he'd experienced, but against who he'd become. And it was in this state of emotional survival that he began to question himself. Did I really return? Or was it just my body? The feeling was of being suspended between what was and what no longer knew how to be. The impact of the war was not in the explicit memories, but in the way he no longer connected with the present. He saw everything but felt nothing. He touched but did not engage. He lived, but was not truly alive. As the weeks passed, the void grew denser. He tried to fill it with routine, with obligations, with attempts at normalcy, but no distraction was enough. The emotional withdrawal turned into actual isolation. He began avoiding family gatherings, meeting friends. Even the simplest conversations with neighbors became too much of an effort, because the more people asked, "How are you?" the harder it was to maintain the facade. The truth is, no one was prepared for what he brought back from the war, and he, even less so. There was no manual. There was no safe space. It was as if he had returned with a secret so heavy it couldn't be put into words. A secret made of noises no one else could hear, of scenes that replayed themselves like nightmares in broad daylight. He carried a battlefield within himself and tried to live with it as if it were normal. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because when the body is present but the soul is in pieces, what happens to the most intimate bonds? What happens to love, trust, identity? And most importantly, what can begin to heal a heart that has grown accustomed to living hidden behind pain? Comment here. I'm on this journey too if you felt that any part of this story spoke to you. He said nothing, but he carried the world inside his chest. A broken world full of noises only he could hear. Sometimes it was just a door creaking, the sound of a passing truck or a streetlight flickering in the middle of the night, and it all came rushing back. His body reacted before he even understood why. His heart raced. A cold sweat broke out. His eyes searched for a threat that no longer existed. But inside him, the battlefield remained active. The problem was, no one saw it, because the scars that hurt the most are precisely the ones no one notices. Time passed, but he seemed frozen in place. The war was over outside, but inside the feeling was of constant siege. The fear was silent but persistent. The fear of trusting, of attaching, of letting his guard down and being hit again, not by bullets, but by memories. He didn't just lose friends in combat. He lost something that seemed impossible to rebuild. The peace of existence, the lightness of living an ordinary day, of laughing without guilt, of hugging without feeling vulnerable. He lost the sense of security even within his own home. And as much as he wanted to, he couldn't explain it. It wasn't a whim. It wasn't drama. It wasn't weakness. It was a deep, ingrained exhaustion that made every daily gesture feel like an uphill climb. Getting dressed, eating, smiling at his children, everything required effort. And the worst part was that on the outside, he still had that strong, controlled appearance. But inside, he was exhausted. Exhausted of pretending everything was okay. Exhausted of carrying alone a pain no one understood. It's called PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. But for him, it was just a distant label. What he felt was far more real than any diagnosis. It was the difficulty sleeping, the nightmares that seemed real, the anger that exploded without warning, the apathy that followed soon after. It was waking up feeling like he hadn't rested. It was seeing the world as a threatening place even when surrounded by love. It was being unable to surrender, not even to someone who had never hurt him. The hidden truth no one spoke aloud was that he felt guilty for coming back, guilt for having survived while others stayed. Guilt for not being able to be the present father he promised to be. Guilt for not being able to connect with his wife, even though he wanted to. It was as if the trauma had erased the bridge between desire and action. He wanted to be there. He wanted to love. He wanted to start over. But something always pulled him back to that inner desert, where everything seemed dangerous, including affection. His mind was constantly on high alert, as if a part of it was still trapped in that minefield, waiting for the next attack. This war-shaped mindset infiltrated everything. He wouldn't relax, wouldn't trust, wouldn't relinquish control, and this contaminated his relationships. His frustration was so great that at times he simply withdrew. He thought this would protect others from himself, but in practice, he was distancing himself from the very people who could help him escape this maze. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject. Because when pain becomes part of our routine, it disguises itself. It hides in small gestures, in prolonged silences, in empty stares, and that's where the danger lies. We get used to the weight, thinking it's part of who we are. But what if it isn't? What if there is a way back? Not to the past, but to a new version of ourselves, a version that can still rebuild itself despite the losses. It was at this point in his journey that he began to realize that ignoring the pain wasn't working, that feigning strength only made him more fragile, and that perhaps to begin healing he needed to first accept that he was wounded, not as a failure but as an essential step in rebuilding. Because only those who have the courage to look at their own wounds truthfully are able to transform them into something that teaches, that connects, that inspires. The transformation begins slowly, and it doesn't begin with magic solutions. It begins with a gesture, a non-judgmental look, a space where he can be who he is without having to pretend. It begins when someone truly listens to him, even when he doesn't know where to begin. And that's when everything begins to change. Because as closed off as he was to the world, there was a thread of hope still burning, a spark that just needed to be nurtured with care, patience, and humanity. Comment here. That makes sense to me. If at any time you too have felt that you were carrying a weight that no one else could see. He couldn't remember exactly when he began to withdraw, when his children's embrace became uncomfortable, when his wife's tender touch became uncomfortable, almost threatening. But it was happening. A slow withdrawal, like closing the windows of a house one by one until the darkness inside. It was as if any gesture of affection set off an alarm within him. The affection, which had once warmed, now felt dangerous. A reminder that, to love, one must open oneself, and opening oneself hurt. It wasn't rational. He knew those people loved him. He knew they were trying to get closer. But the trauma reprogrammed something in his mindset. Anything that required emotional surrender was perceived as a risk, as if love were a trap ready to disarm what little remained of him. He had built a fortress around his own heart, tall, thick, silent. Not out of malice, but for survival. On the outside, he became increasingly cold. His answers were curt, his gestures hard, his gaze distant. Inside, it was like living in rubble. The pain wasn't just from what he'd lost in the war, but from what he believed he'd lost within himself, the ability to feel, to trust, to be vulnerable, and it was slowly destroying him. Because love was all he wanted, but it was also all he could no longer do. The hidden truth no one realized was that he hadn't become indifferent. He had become overly sensitive, to the point that any attempt at closeness triggered a defense system, as if the mere act of loving again could send him back to the pain of loss, mourning, and parting. It was as if he had learned that loving inevitably means suffering, and this realization pushed him into isolation. It's strange how fear disguises itself. Sometimes it appears as coldness, other times as aggression. Sometimes it shows itself through silence, and it was through these channels that he began to lose contact with his own family. They were there but at the same time absent. He participated in meals, but not in the moments. He would say good morning, but not say how he felt. He would reply, everything's fine, but never tell the truth, because the truth hurt more than he could bear. There was one night in particular when everything became clearer. The youngest son approached with a drawing he'd made at school, a family holding hands. But on the paper, he wasn't included. When asked why, the child replied with brutal innocence, "Because you're never with us." It was like a shot to the chest. The image was symbolic. He really wasn't there. Not in the drawings, not in the routine. not in the heart of those simple moments that build a family. He wondered, how did I get here? How could someone who had survived bombs, gunfire, and loss now be unable to bear a touch of affection? The answer lay in the layers of pain that had accumulated silently, never named. The impact of the war hadn't stayed on the battlefield. He carried it all in his gaze, in his restrained gestures, in the words he avoided. And this emotional baggage began to shape his decisions, his relationships, his identity. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because when the fear of love sets in, it changes the way we see ourselves, how we connect, and how we choose to live. And sometimes the greatest transformation comes not from without, but from within, from an almost imperceptible but powerful shift that happens when we begin to name what we feel and understand that love doesn't have to be a threat, but can be a refuge, a rebuilding, a new beginning. Write it down. I'm on this journey too. If you've ever felt that loving required more courage than seemed possible. It was on an ordinary afternoon, one of those where everything seems the same, that he saw her for the first time. He was sitting in the back of the clinic, waiting for another appointment in silence, like someone simply fulfilling an obligation, unable to believe that anything there could actually help him. His eyes fixed on the floor, his mind distant, caught in thoughts no one else could reach. And then she arrived, without announcing, without forcing, without invading. She simply sat beside him with a light, almost imperceptible yet strangely welcoming presence. She was a new therapist at the center, they said, but in that moment, she seemed anything but ordinary. She didn't try to make conversation right away. She didn't offer prepackaged phrases. She didn't ask, "How are you?" like everyone else did. She just stood there, present, and that, for some reason, disarmed something in him. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel the need to run away. Not from her gaze, not from her presence, not from himself. It was as if she'd found an invisible chink in that thick armor and knew exactly where not to press. And that was new. Scary, but new. In the days that followed, their encounters became more frequent. Small exchanges. Looks that said more than words. She spoke little but listened a lot. She listened with her eyes, with her body, with her soul. And he, little by little, began to realize he didn't need to prove anything. That there in that silent space he could simply exist, without being the soldier, without being the absent husband, without being the father who blamed himself for no longer knowing how to love. Just someone wounded, trying to find his way back. Their connection wasn't marked by grand events. There were no cinematic twists or dramatic gestures. The impact lay precisely in the simplicity, in the coffee she left on the table without saying anything, in the way she waited for him to finish a sentence even when he froze mid-sentence, in her patience in not forcing answers, but allowing silences. It was behind the scenes of this relationship that something began to change. A subtle transformation, invisible to the outside world, but one he felt, day after day, deep within. There was something in her presence that didn't judge, that didn't flinch at his harshness, nor flinch at his dry responses. It was as if she understood, without him saying so, that this wasn't rejection but defensiveness, a reflex of someone who had already lost too much, and who now reacted with fear to anything resembling affection. But she didn't back down, and that, to him, was almost incomprehensible, because he was used to pushing away anyone who tried to get close. But she stayed, and it was during one of these silent sessions that he said the first thing that didn't come automatically. "I don't know why you're still here," she replied with a simplicity that dismantled him. "Because you still are too." And in that instant, something gave way. It was imperceptible on the outside, but inside, a crack opened in the wall he'd built for so long. For the first time in years, he felt like maybe he could trust, not her, not yet, but the process, the possibility that there was a place in the world where he didn't have to pretend to be okay. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because behind every simple gesture lies a universe of revelations. Sometimes what transforms a life isn't a big decision, but a constant presence. A person who stays even when it would be easier to leave. And when that happens, defenses begin to crumble, not through force, but through care. And the heart, which was once a pure battlefield, begins to make room for something new, the chance to feel again, without fear, without haste, without guilt. Comment here. That makes sense to me. If you have ever lived, or witnessed, a moment when an unexpected presence began to transform your world from the inside out. At first, he couldn't quite pinpoint what was changing. It was something so subtle, so different from everything he'd ever known, that it didn't feel like a transformation. It felt like a pause in the darkness. She remained there, with that calm, steady gaze that didn't demand or force. And it was in this silent setting that for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel pressured to be strong. She didn't expect quick answers. She didn't react with fear to his harsh confessions. And this, though simple, was profoundly revolutionary for someone who had spent so long trying to survive amidst the internal noise. The changes began with the details. He began to look her in the eye for a few seconds longer. Then he began responding with full sentences, not just yes or no. He even started arriving a little early for sessions, as if he were somehow beginning to yearn for that time. It wasn't just therapy. It was the one place where he felt he didn't need to wear armor. And that wasn't just rare. It was precious. A hidden revelation for someone who had always associated vulnerability with weakness. The way she reacted to his silence was one of the things that most marked him. When he froze, she didn't try to fill the void with words. She just waited, like someone who understands that silence also has language. And this respect for his time awakened something profound. Because until then, the world seemed to want him to hurry, to get over it, to heal quickly. But she demanded nothing, and that nothing was all he needed at that moment. Over time, he began to bring small insights home. He began to notice sounds he'd previously ignored: birds chirping, rain pattering on the window pane, a child's muffled laughter in the other room. Things that had seemed distant became present again, and even though the pain hadn't gone away, it no longer filled the entire space. There were now gaps of light, brief moments of presence, a kind of connection he'd previously believed he'd never feel again. This shift in mindset happened slowly. He didn't wake up one day feeling healed. Nothing like that. The real transformation happens behind the scenes, in the silent decision to no longer run away from himself, in the recognition that feeling wasn't synonymous with weakness, but with life, that allowing himself to be touched by simple gestures like a genuine listening ear or a coffee left on the table was a form of reconnection, a return to who he had always been, but had forgotten in the midst of pain. With each new encounter, he began to trust a little more, not just her but himself. He began to risk small gestures at home too, a longer conversation with his son, a loving comment to his wife, a long look in the mirror, like someone trying to recognize themselves without rushing. It wasn't easy. Sometimes he retreated, sometimes the fear hit again, but there was something new growing there. The awareness that he wasn't trapped forever, that even after everything there was a path, and this path was built in the daily routine, in the details, in what previously seemed irrelevant. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because we tend to think that only grand gestures heal, but often, strength lies in simplicity, in respecting the other person's time, in constant presence, in welcoming silence. That's how he began to be reborn, not with promises but with care. And if you've ever been through a process like this, where small actions sparked big changes within you, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Comment here. That makes sense to me. If any part of this silent journey also resembles yours. It wasn't planned. In fact, he wasn't even sure why he'd gone that day. It was a cloudy Saturday, the kind where the world seems to move more slowly. She'd left a discreet message, almost as if she wasn't expecting a reply. If you want to talk, I'll be here. Something in him, without him knowing how to explain it, felt the urge to go. Not because he was ready, but because, for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like he had to be there. Just being there was enough. The space was the same as always, but the atmosphere wasn't. There was something different that day. Maybe in the silence between them, maybe in her gaze, or in the way he entered and didn't sit down immediately, as if rehearsing a step that had taken a lifetime to take. She said nothing. She just stood there, her hands loose as if she knew any sudden movement could ruin that delicate moment. And he, for once, didn't resist. It wasn't a long hug, nor was it full of words. It was brief, unexpected, but real. When he stepped forward and embraced her, his body still tense and his heart racing, she didn't respond with intensity. She simply welcomed him, without invading, without squeezing, without moving forward. It was in that very gesture that he understood he wasn't being restrained. He was being respected. And this difference, which seems subtle, was what struck a chord. Because for years he believed that allowing himself to feel was giving in, exposing himself to danger. But there in that moment he discovered something new. Feeling can also be liberating. The embrace lasted only a few seconds, but something that had been locked inside him for years began to unravel. First, his shoulders relaxed. Then his breathing returned to normal. Finally, his eyes, which had previously avoided contact, were now filled with tears, unashamedly so. They weren't tears of pain. They were tears of relief, as if he had finally found a place where he could stop fighting. For the first time, he cried, not because he was hurt, but because he had found a space where the pain didn't need to be hidden. In that gesture, he understood the impact a human presence can have, how much more powerful a hug can be than 1,000 words. Because in that restrained yet intentional touch, he was reminded that he was still alive, and more than that there were still parts within him that could feel, react, open. The ice covering his soul began to slowly melt, and in place of that ancient armor, a new possibility began to emerge. A path that didn't ignore the pain, but didn't feed it either. A path where it was possible to walk with scars, but without fear. This revelation wasn't just emotional. It reorganized his entire internal structure. It was as if, for years, he had sustained an entire castle made of defenses, and now, with that simple gesture, he realized he could leave, that he could build something new, with fewer walls and more windows. That embrace didn't erase the pain of the past, but it gave him a new lens through which to see the present, and that was revolutionary. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because when we live in a state of alert for too long, even the simplest gesture can become a key that opens the door to a lighter, more honest life, more connected to what truly matters. And maybe, just maybe, what we so desperately seek isn't the absence of pain, but the permission to feel without fear of being crushed by it. Comment here, I'm on this journey too, if you have ever lived or witnessed a moment like this, where a simple gesture made room for something much bigger to happen within you. What happened after that embrace wasn't a movie's happy ending, full of light and quick resolutions. It was something else, more real, more delicate, more profound. He didn't emerge transformed into a new person, but he emerged different, with a knot untied inside, with a small crack open for what would come next. And what followed wasn't a romance. It wasn't an overwhelming passion that erased everything he'd experienced. It was something rarer, a reunion with his own life. For a long time, he thought love was dangerous, that loving meant putting himself at risk again, that it was something that hurt, that left scars, like so many he carried. But little by little, he began to understand that true love doesn't demand, doesn't squeeze, doesn't invade. It embraces, it listens, it waits. And he saw this not only in that silent therapist, but in the small gestures of everyday life, in the daughter who still left drawings on the bedroom door, in the hot coffee his wife made in the morning, even without saying anything, in the friends who kept texting even without a reply. It was in this seemingly simple daily life that he began to learn what previously seemed impossible, to love without fear, not in the romantic fairy tale sense, but to love as a living verb, as a state of openness, a kind of affection that begins within himself, in the way he began to treat himself, in the kindness he began to offer his own body, in the patience he had with his own limits, because before anything else, he needed to allow himself to be loved for himself. This was the quietest, yet most powerful turning point, when he stopped seeing himself as a walking mistake, when he stopped believing he was a problem to be fixed, and began to see himself as someone rebuilding, someone worthy of love, someone who could still smile even with deep scars, someone who could still trust, even with fear whispering from time to time. This shift in mindset was what redefined everything. It's easy to believe that we can only love when we're completely healed, that we first need to resolve everything, erase the past, cleanse all wounds. But he discovered the opposite, that love, in fact, paves the way for healing, that it doesn't require perfection, it requires presence, availability, the courage to take small steps even with a heart still in pieces. And so, almost without realizing it, he began reconnecting, first with the present, then with other people, then with existence itself. He began to notice details that had previously gone unnoticed, the light streaming through the window at just the right moment, the smell of his favorite meal in the kitchen, the music playing in the background as I walked down the street. Small moments, but full of meaning. It was in this space that he learned to smile again, Not that forced social automatic smile, but the kind of smile that appears without warning, when the soul feels relief, when the soul remembers it's still alive. And yes, he was afraid along the way. He had setbacks. There were days when the old darkness almost pulled him back, but now he knew he didn't have to go through it alone. He knew there were outstretched hands, that there were trustworthy presences, that the world wasn't just a battlefield. It was also shelter, also reunion, also opportunity. And the love he rediscovered wasn't a final destination, but a way of walking, a new way of being in the world. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because there's a hidden truth about pain and affection that few people talk about. Sometimes, trauma creates a lens that distorts everything, and loving becomes an immense challenge because the mind, conditioned by survival, no longer recognizes what's safe. But when someone insists on staying, when something inside us decides to try even when we're afraid, a turning point happens, a silent revelation that changes everything. We don't have to be ready to love, we just have to be willing to try. Comment here. That makes sense to me. If this idea of relearning to love slowly and truly has ever touched you at some point in your own journey, today, those who look at him might not even imagine the storm he once carried within. He walks the streets with a different posture, not the rigidity typical of those always ready for combat, but a serene firmness, like someone who has learned that the greatest strength lies not in protecting oneself from everything, but in allowing life to enter again. His eyes remain sunken, but now they shine differently. It's no longer the look of someone hiding, but of someone observing the world with curiosity, with respect, with the awareness that being alive is, in itself, a gift. He still carries the scars of the past, of course. They haven't disappeared, they haven't become pleasant memories, nor have they completely stopped hurting. But now they no longer define who he is. They've been transformed. What once weighed him down has now become a path. What once distanced him from people is now precisely what brings him closer, because he understood that every scar has a voice, and when we learn to listen to it, it stops shouting and starts teaching. That's what he decided to do, use his own story as a bridge. Today he talks with other veterans, some younger, others as quiet as he once was. He doesn't force advice. He doesn't try to rush anyone's process. He simply shares, with the simplicity of someone who has already traversed the darkness and knows that not every light needs to come screaming. Sometimes, all it takes is a constant presence, an "I understand" said at the right time, a respectful silence that welcomes without invading. And it was in this space that he found purpose again, not because he became a hero or because he stopped feeling pain, but because he recognized that his pain has value when shared with empathy. This decision didn't come from a grand revelation, but from a series of small choices. Choices that required courage, yes, but were also guided by a new kind of compass, the awareness that no one needs to carry the burden alone. This transformation didn't alienate him from the world. On the contrary, it brought him back to it. Little by little, he reconnected with his family. He learned to say, "I love you," without feeling like he was exposing himself too much. He learned to listen without fear of being judged. He learned, most importantly, to accept help, and in this process, he strengthened not only himself, but also the bonds around him. His home, once silent and filled with distance, now pulsates with presence. Not perfect, but real. Full of flaws, but also full of effort. The mindset he now carries is completely different from before. Where there was once control, there is now flexibility. Where there was escape, there is now presence. Where there was fear of feeling, there is now space to feel without drowning. He understood that being strong isn't about enduring everything in silence. It's about knowing when to open up, when to ask for support, when to allow himself to be cared for. And this became the foundation for everything, for relationships, for work, for the way he sees the world. It's interesting to observe how the biggest changes happen behind the scenes, not in the big speeches nor in the dramatic scenes, but in the routine, in the way he holds his coffee cup unhurriedly, in the time he dedicates to listening to others without interrupting, in the times he allows himself to laugh out loud, even when memories try to pull him back. He still has bad days, of course, but today he knows that bad days don't negate the entire journey. They're part of it, and he's learned to respect that. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because this transformation he experienced is in fact an ongoing journey, a process that never ends, but that with each step reveals more layers, more strength, more truth. And if there's anything powerful in all of this, it's realizing that the pain that nearly destroyed you is now the foundation of a life that inspires, that welcomes, that teaches, even unintentionally, just by being who you are. Comment here. I'm on this journey too. If you feel that your pain can also be transformed into a bridge to something greater. Maybe you're living that exact moment right now, the one where everything seems fine on the outside, but inside there's an inexplicable weariness, a silence that weighs heavy, even when there's noise all around. Maybe you're trying to smile at others while, inside, you struggle to stay together. Maybe you're collecting days where simply existing is an effort. And maybe, like that man, you've learned to hide your scars so well that even you've begun to believe they're gone. But they are. And that's okay, because feeling isn't a mistake. Feeling is a sign that you're still alive. The hidden truth that almost no one has the courage to say is that starting over doesn't require a major shift. It doesn't have to be a drastic change, a spectacular decision, or a sudden miracle. Sometimes starting over begins with a look, with a simple gesture, with the courage to speak, even with a trembling voice, with the willingness to accept help, or perhaps simply by choosing to listen to a story like this until the end, and letting it remind you that there is still hope, there is still a path, there is still time. Starting over isn't about forgetting what happened. It's not about pretending nothing hurt. Starting over is about giving new meaning to what still beats inside you. It's about realizing that scars don't need to be hidden. They can be carried with dignity. They tell us something important about who you are, what you've faced, and most importantly, about the silent strength that brought you here. Because yes, you're here. Maybe hurt, maybe without answers, but here. And that says a lot. Every decision you make from now on can take you to a new place, even if that new place is still within the same body, the same house, the same routine. The difference lies in how you choose to look at yourself. You can continue to believe you have to face everything alone, or you can begin to accept that loving, trusting, feeling, and even crying don't make you weak. They make you human. And that, when truly accepted, is liberating. The journey of healing is not linear. It comes with ups and downs, with breakthroughs and setbacks. But if there's one thing it demands of you, it's not perfection. It's persistence. It's patience. It's presence. And above all, it's the courage to continue, even when everything seems to suggest otherwise. The courage to believe that you can still live with ease, that you can still trust the right people, that you can still rebuild bonds, that you can still smile with truth, and that you can still love, yes, love, without fear. This is the beauty of the silent reunions life offers us. Sometimes it comes disguised as a simple conversation, sometimes an unexpected hug, a genuine listening ear, or even a video like this. Don't underestimate the impact of a small spark in the darkness. That's how he began to emerge from the depths of the pit, not with a scream, but with a whisper, a reminder that there was something inside him that still wanted to live. And perhaps you feel that same whisper within you too. Even weak, even timid, it's there. Now I want to delve even deeper into this topic, because when we understand that starting over doesn't depend on being ready, but on being willing, everything changes. Transformation doesn't begin the day the pain goes away. It begins the day you decide you won't let pain define who you are. That's the turning point, and it can happen right now, while you breathe, think, and realize you're still in control of your next choice. Comment here. That makes sense to me. If somewhere inside you this message found space. If you've stuck with me this far, it's because this story spoke to a part of you that might have been forgotten, and that says a lot about what you're searching for and what you deserve to find. So if this kind of content resonates with you, if it helps you breathe differently, reflect, or even see yourself with more affection, subscribe to the channel. This is the space for this. For us to talk truthfully, without rushing, and transform pain into a path. Leave the phrase here in the comments, "I'm with you until the end," just so I know you've come this far with an open heart. It may seem simple, but knowing there are people on the other side going through this journey too makes all the difference. And if this video touched something important to you, please leave a like. This small gesture helps this content reach those who might need to hear exactly what it says today. There's a video here that complements everything we talked about. Click and continue with me there. We still have a lot to talk about.